Hey guys, and welcome back to our devotional series walking through the book of Daniel. And today we're looking at chapter 9, and this is where it starts to get kind of interesting. So Daniel chapter 9 is again not a vision that Daniel's having, but more of an explanation of things that he's already seen. And so we see the archangel Gabriel show up in the opening of chapter 9 again, and he's been told to give Daniel an answer to the prayers and the questions that he's been asking God. And so Daniel opens up this chapter and he says, "In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, a Mede by birth." And so what we're looking at now, this is during the Persian reign, so it's towards the end of Daniel's life. He's going to be an older man by now, probably in his 50s and 60s again. He's going to be bouncing back and forth throughout his book. But he's been praying to God. And we see the opening here, he's looked through the scriptures and realized that there is a period of 70 years from the exile to Babylon, which was when Babylon came in at the very beginning of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar came and took them as young boys to become servants to Babylon. But he's looking at scriptures and he sees in the book of Jeremiah that there was a period of 70 years. After 70 years, God had promised to bring the Israelites back to Jerusalem. And so Daniel falls down, he goes through this really long prayer, this beautiful prayer where he's basically crying out and asking God to forgive the sins of his nation. Even though Daniel may have individually not been guilty of these sins that Israel had committed, he's realizing that as an Israelite, they are all guilty for not following God. And so he's falling down and crying out to God on behalf of his people. And at the end of his prayer, he says, "Listen closely," in verse 18, "My God, and hear. Open your eyes and see our desolations and the city that bears your name. For we are not presenting our petitions before you based on our righteous acts, but based on your abundant compassion. Lord, hear. Lord, forgive. Lord, listen and act. My God, for your own sake, do not delay, because your city and your people bear your name." And we see this right here. Daniel is giving a very intimate prayer. He's crying out to God. And he's asking God, "Lord, for your sake, remember the promises you've given us. Be merciful, be compassionate. Don't do this because we are good and we're righteous, but because you are compassionate." And when he's done praying this is when Gabriel shows up. And Gabriel gives him this message kind of explaining his visions and his prayers to him. And this is a very interesting passage, depending on what version of the Bible you're reading, what translation. It could be called the 70 weeks of years, the 70 sevens, the 70 sets of sevens. I'm looking at the Christian Standard Bible, CSB, right now, and it's called the 70 weeks of years, and that gives us the easiest understanding. As Gabriel opens up his explanation to Daniel, in verse 24, he says in the CSB, 70 weeks are decreed. And again, if you're reading the ESV or different, it may say 70 sevens or 70 sets of 7 are decreed. Now, it's kind of confusing what that means, but what it means, and this goes back to some Old Testament talk, is 70 sets of 7 was 70 years, 70 sets of 7 years, and 70 weeks is the same thing. It's not literally 70 weeks, but it's 70 sets of 7 years, which comes out to 490 years. So this is a long span of time that Gabriel's talking about right here, and it's confusing because it doesn't say 70 sets of 7 years, it says 77s or 70 weeks. But what he's doing is he's being symbolic. And so he's talking about this, he says, 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city, to bring a rebellion to an end, to put a stop to sin, to atone for iniquity, to bring an everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. And so as we read through this, Gabriel seems to be talking about the end of sin. He says to put a stop to sin, to atone for iniquity. And we look at that and we think, okay, well, Jesus was the end of sin. He paid for sin on the cross. And so it seems that Gabriel is pointing forward to a time when sin has its end. And we read through this, and he's listing out some more stuff, and he's talking about this. And in verse 26, he says, after those 62 weeks, or the first 62 sets of 7 years, the anointed one will be cut off and will have nothing. And so in this case, we can look at the anointed one and we could think, okay, Jesus was the anointed one of God, and him being cut off, well, Jesus was crucified. He died. He was dead. And so we see here that Gabriel seems to be talking about the death of Christ, that after 62 sets of 7 years, which would come out to 414 years, I think, and he's talking that, 434 years, that Jesus will be cut off, will be dead, this anointed one, and then he kind of goes and he talks about this ruler that will come and will desecrate the temple, desecrate the holy place. And at the very end of this, Gabriel explains to him that this individual, this person who will come in and desecrate, in verse 27 he says, will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. Now again, we've understood week to mean a set of 7 years, so 1 week would be 7 years. He'll make a firm covenant with many for 7 years, but in the middle of this set of 7 years, in the middle of this week, 3.5 years in, he will put a stop to sacrifice and offering, and the abomination of desolation will be on a wing of the temple until the decreed destruction is poured out on the desolator. And so what we have to understand when we interpret this, the first 69 weeks, the first 69 sets of 7 years, when Gabriel's walking through this, those are together. There is a gap between the 69th set of 7 years and the last 70th set of 7 years, the last 7 years. And a lot of people believe that that is the age of the church that we live in right now. Christ died, he's resurrected, we enter the age of the church, and there is this gap between this last 7 years that Gabriel's talking about. Now in this 7 years at the end that Gabriel's talking about, he's talking about this week, and that half of it, this desolator will make a covenant of peace. Now if we were to look to the book of Revelation, we see this talked about more in Revelation. Daniel and Revelation go hand in hand because both these passages are talking about the end times, the tribulation. And we see in Revelation that the Antichrist comes and he makes a covenant of peace with the world. He basically comes and says, you know what, times are really tougher now, we're going to have peace, worldwide peace. And for 3.5 years he honors it, but at the 3.5 year mark he comes in, and Revelation talks about this again, the abomination of desolation. Basically what it is, the Antichrist somehow will walk into the temple at this point, which is rebuilt, and will desecrate it. He will declare himself to be God. He will defy the living God at the 3.5 year mark. And then for 3.5 years, the last 3.5 of that last 7 years, we have turmoil and tribulation, the end time, the end tribulation. But what's interesting to note, we won't get into all the details right now. There's so much more that's going on here that parallels Revelation. What we want to look at is this, because looking at any kind of end time can be terrifying and can put a lot of stress on us. And looking at the world nowadays with the coronavirus can leave us absolutely hopeless. But what happens here is at the very end of this is what Daniel says. At the end of verse 27, and the abomination of desolation will be on a wing of the temple. So the Antichrist comes in, he desecrates the temple, until the decreed destruction is poured out on the desolator. And so we see that this time of turmoil and tribulation will go on until destruction is poured out on the desolator, or the Antichrist, the one who is causing all of this rebellion and turmoil. And so what we see is at the end, again, Daniel hits home every chapter of this, God wins. There's no doubt on it. Just because times are bad, it doesn't mean, well, maybe God has changed his mind, or maybe things aren't quite what God expected in Daniel's words. No. Daniel's very clear, times will get bad, but God does win. He's already decreed it. This is what happens. Jesus was the climax. That was when all of history turned on its head. Sin was paid for, death was abolished, but we live in the not yet, okay? We live in the age of the church where the gospel is spreading throughout the whole world. Once the whole world has heard the name of Christ, the end time comes. And it gets really bad for a period of time, but God promised at the end of this period of tribulation, destruction comes on the Antichrist. Death fully wiped away, never again. God wins. Guys, I hope that going through these passages of Daniel is an encouragement to you. I hope that seeing some of his visions and explanations that God ultimately is sovereign and God triumphs gives you hope. Right now is not the end. This is not all that there is. God is still working. And yes, there are difficult times right now. Yes, there's pain, there's suffering, there's loneliness, and there's death. But God is moving history along his plan to a time when there is none of that anymore, where everything is made right once more. Guys, I love you. I'm so excited. Middle schoolers get to hang out with you tonight. High schoolers looking forward to spending time with you tomorrow. If you want to reach out before then, feel free to comment down below. I'd love to hear what you're learning and what's on your mind as you're reading through these passages. Or feel free to message us on Instagram. Just tell us how your week is going. I love you guys, and I look forward to talking to you soon.